morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. The gentleman on the screen is Mr. Eddie Cross. To me, he is one of those white liberals, white Rhodesian liberals who has gone rogue. He was a close associate of the late Morgan Tsvangirai, excuse me, and he was in the MDC ever since its launch, and was in the government of national unity. And this is the government of national unity that failed to implement even one democratic reform. One wonders what he was doing there as one of Tsvangirai's close advisors, if he could not advise him to implement reforms. He has since the 2017 decoupled himself completely with the opposition, and there's been Mnangagwa's cheerleader praising the regime to the rafters, talking about how the economy was going to recover, although no evidence of that recovery has ever materialized. Today, he is talking about the impact of sanctions, the sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe. Let's just listen to him.
Because it keeps us isolated internationally. Our international isolation, the impact of Zadera is very serious. Zadera costs us a lot of money. And, I just take one small personal example. I bought a car a couple of years ago in Japan, and I had to pay some $10,000 for it. I couldn't transfer US dollars. I had to go to my bank eventually after 3 months and buy 1 million yen and send yen, because if every time I tried to transfer 10,000 US dollars, the banks, international banks, said, no, Zadera, correspondent bank. We don't have any correspondent banks. How can you work like that? I mean, the Americans say that their sanctions are targeted. They're not. They affect every Zimbabwean without exception, because they've isolated us completely from the international monetary system. It doesn't matter what they say, because the Americans are so dominant internationally. If they threaten international banks like CBZ was fined $385 million. That's 3 times its capital base by the Americans for violating sanctions. When we investigated that, there were 14,000 violations. Some of them were payments internationally for visa applications, $100. And these guys said that's a violation of Zadera. And as a result, Deutsche Bank won't trade with Stanbic Bank, even though they've had a relationship with Stanbic Bank for the last 50 years. And who does trade with us? South African banks. We're back in like the Rhodesian days, where we want to transfer money abroad, we have to ask a South African bank to do it for us, or a Botswana bank, or a bank in Mozambique, or a bank in Zambia. We can't do it ourselves. And that costs money. That costs money. For me, in buying my car, it cost me 7% of the value of the currency. That's very expensive. And so I think that, and any political, we make a misstep here, and it is blown up by the international.
Well, what he's saying is true. Sanctions, directly or indirectly, will affect everybody. Just as sanctions during the Rhodesia regime affected everybody. It didn't only affect the whites, it affected everybody. But let's get this issue of sanctions into its proportion. I believe that sanctions, for every dollar that Zimbabwe has paid because of the sanctions, we must have paid at least $100 because of gross mismanagement. And we must have paid $1,000 because of rampant corruption. I don't have to remind you of the recent Al Jazeera Gold Mafia documentary. Zimbabwe has been selling gold, $2 billion worth of gold every year. And yet 80% of that is being smuggled. When you smuggle, as we saw in that documentary, what you smuggle out and what you get from those gold mafia is another matter. Indeed, some of them were smuggling real gold and bringing in dirty money, which was then used to buy our real gold. And that dirty money, they declare that they have brought in 2 million. But in reality, they only bring a fraction of that. This is what the looting we have reached now. And it's not only happening in gold. It's been happening with diamonds. During the GNU, when Mr. Eddie Cross was in government himself, he was a member of parliament for the MDC. He himself reported of the looting of diamonds, the wholesale looting of diamonds. How much did we lose then? So it becomes totally meaningless to start wittering about sanctions costing us $1 and yet say nothing about the corruption that is costing us $1,000. This becomes totally meaningless. But more significantly, we have got to accept here that in Zimbabwe, while we accepted sanctions being imposed on the white regime, the argument was very simple. If we want to end the oppressive white regime, we've got to fight at every front. And imposing sanctions was one of them. Many of the blacks, both in Zimbabwe and even outside our neighbor in South Africa and so forth, all supported sanctions being imposed on, say, for instance, the white regime in Zimbabwe or the apartheid regime in South Africa, to force the regime to end the oppression. And yet the same people now are at the front saying we don't want sanctions. Well, one of the reasons, yes, there may be other reasons the West have given for imposing sanctions, is that Zimbabwe has failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. That cannot be denied. Even our own regional body in the recent election confirmed that Zimbabwe rigged the elections. The continental body, the UN, the AU, sorry, condemned the elections as a farce. As long as sanctions are in place, and the argument is stop rigging the elections, stop the human rights abuses, No Zimbabwean with any brain would call for them to be lifted. No. Because the cost, yes, is $1 of having those sanctions in place. But if we were to end the corruption, to end this dictatorship, what we gain is the end of the dictatorship, which is priceless in itself, the end of the mismanagement, $100, the end of the rampant corruption, $1,000. How can anyone say that is not a price worth paying? We have got a problem in Zimbabwe where the mentality has now become that white oppression was there, but black oppression is not there. I think if you are the core face of it, oppression is oppression. You suffer in dumb anguish, regardless of the color of the person who is oppressing you. It's the oppression that you are concerned about, that you want to end, that you're fighting. This tendency, particularly with many of our African leaders, to pretend that since the end of white colonial rule, there is no corrupt, incompetent, and oppressive black regime is nonsensical. It is nonsense. We need to deal with the reality here. If sanctions were justified before independence to end white colonial oppression, I don't see how we can say sanctions are no longer justified now. And what is more, Zanu PF has used the presence of sanctions to justify rigging elections. One of his arguments why it denied Zimbabweans in the diaspora the vote was that Zanu PF will not be able to travel into the diaspora to campaign for those votes. First of all, that is nonsense, because even if you say, okay, you will not grant those Zimbabweans in the diaspora in America, in the rest of Europe that have imposed those sanctions on Zanu PF leadership, what about those in South Africa, Botswana, and all the rest of the world that have not imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe? But more significantly, we cannot accept that argument that sanctions, the presence of sanctions, can be used as an excuse for denying somebody their fundamental right, their right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country, is not negotiable. If we are going to accept that argument, that because there are sanctions, Zimbabweans should be denied the vote, where is it going to end? What has got the ordinary villager in the rural area got to do with sanctions? And yet, as we saw in these recent elections, they were being frog marched to attend Zanu PF rallies, and then frog marched to go and vote for Zanu PF. Are we going to blame Sidera for that? I think we need to deal with the problem, the real problem here. And I think all these arguments that have been put forward about sanctions, they have been used by the regime to justify the tyranny, the oppression. Just as much as the whites before independence used to justify denying the blacks their right because they wanted to stop the communists getting into power. Well, they didn't stop the communists getting into power, did they? If anything at all, they aided and abetted the communists to get into power. Because by the time they finally were forced out of office, it was by the communists. The Chinese and the Russians helped the liberation parties like Zanu PF. And of course, the price we have paid as a nation was that we've been stuck with the Chinese. Cannot be any denying that one of the biggest nations that has got influence in Zimbabwe are the Chinese and the Russians. They've been propping up this Zanu PF dictatorship. There's no doubt about it. And of course, needless to say, they are also the principal beneficiaries of the wholesale looting that is taking place in Zimbabwe. I totally reject this argument that sanctions should be lifted because they are causing suffering to the ordinary Zimbabwean. For the simple reason that they are worse things that are causing suffering to the ordinary Zimbabwean. Notably, the mismanagement, the corruption, and above all else, the tyrannical regime. And as long as the sanctions are there aiding to the fight for democratic change, I would say the sanctions must stay. The price we pay for the sanctions to end this tyranny is worth it. People like Eddie Cross are known to have been cheering and applauding this Mnangagwa regime. I've yet to hear him condemn the regime for rigging the elections. This is at the heart of it. Let's hold free, fair, and credible elections. If the Americans still decide that they're going to maintain the sanctions, then we'll deal with it then. To pretend that we must continue to have the dictatorship because there are sanctions is totally ridiculous. Totally unacceptable. And I think people like Eddie Cross should really rethink of their irrational arguments. It's one thing being a liberal, but when you become a rogue, that is totally unacceptable. Because of course, it's videos like this that Zanu PF welcomes, particularly as on the 25th of this month, there's the anti-sanctions day for the whole of SADC region. And it is no secret that South Africa has taken up the drum as well. ANC made a party resolution in November last year saying that they will not allow regime change in Zimbabwe as long as there are sanctions. How anyone can justify now supporting Zanu PF, giving it political legitimacy, when they know, and this time it's not a question of the West said the elections were rigged. SADC itself has said the elections were rigged. The AU itself has said the elections were rigged. Are ANC going to support and still impose Zanu PF to stop regime change? We have heard this argument on sanctions for the last 20 years. The only reason why it's still on the table is that we've got a regime that controls the media, that controls all the resources, and therefore then are able to impose whatever topic they want on the nation. And the nation will never be allowed to move on. This issue of sanctions should have been settled a long time ago. It is not an issue. The real issue is gross mismanagement, corruption, and tyranny. Let's address the issue of rigged elections. And if the Americans and the rest of the West still maintain their sanctions, then we can deal with it. That is the time we should address it. The issue of rigged elections is within our control. Why are we failing to end it? It's not the West that is rigging the elections. It's Zanu PF that is rigging the elections. Why is people like Eddie Cross not saying it? We have got a regime that rigged elections in August. And come end of this month, there's a very high chance that the ANC government in South Africa will use its influence in SADC and grant Zanu PF political legitimacy. And according to the Secretary General of ANC, as long as there are sanctions on Zimbabwe, they will not allow regime change. This is an argument that we can no longer tolerate. Zanu PF rigged the elections. Zanu PF denied the people of Zimbabwe a meaningful say in the governance of the country. Zanu PF is illegitimate. Sanctions or no sanctions, Zanu PF is illegitimate. That is the message we have got to send out there. And people like Eddie Cross should really stop wittering about issues they know are actually irrelevant. Sanctions are not Zimbabwe's biggest problem. Mismanagement and corruption are Zimbabwe's biggest problem, and tyranny. And those are things that we can address. Why are we not addressing them? Why are we talking about something that we have no control over, and yet saying nothing about those which we have control over? Why are you praising a regime that is just rigged the election that you know yourself is illegitimate? Let's deal with the problem of legitimacy here. Let's restore the right of every Zimbabwean to a meaningful say in the governance of the country. That is the number one priority here. And we will not allow some people to come in and impose some trivial matters and make them appear as if those are the big issues that the nation has got to face. That is not the big issue at all. Sanctions is not the big issue. Mismanagement, corruption, and tyranny are the big issue. And as long as we have got a regime that is able to rig elections and impose its will, we'll never address those problems. Mismanagement will continue. Corruption will continue. So let's deal with the problem of rigged elections. That is the number one issue. Address it. If you don't want to address it, then shut up. It's that simple. Thank you and good day.